Hey there, this is Robert Kornacki, CSO of DC Spark. Today I'm excited to announce that we're releasing our next small Urbit project that's called Authenticate with Urbit ID. This is effectively a Gull agent, so a Urbit backend app which runs on your Urbit ship, which allows web servers and websites to go through an authentication protocol to ensure that users who are trying to use their web service, whether that's a website, something that's like an API or otherwise, with their Urbit ID as a login method, they can use Authenticate with Urbit ID to ensure that the user is who they say they are. So, when we got started with UrbitVisor initially, some of the people in the community thought that the only use case was for logging into websites. And so this is something that a number of people do really want, and that's why we worked on building the Authenticate with Urbit ID Gull app. The different protocols available for authenticating people, like OAuth for example, were all analyzed and taken account of, and based off of the primitives available to us and the different choices we had, effectively I decided to create a new protocol that was simpler than everything else while also not relying on crypto keys. So on one end of the spectrum you have OAuth, for example, which doesn't really work well in the Urbit context because you have to effectively create a backup method. So if a ship breaches, you can then take the codes from the ship prior to the breach, pass through the breach, and that's not very clean in terms of just making that all work, making it seamless, and it's just overall a lot more complexity than needed. While on the other end of the spectrum, you have the idea of using your crypto keys to sign, to prove that you own an identity on the Ethereum network, so an Urbit ID. On this side of the spectrum, you have other issues such as comets not being able to prove their identity, or moons. Also, in addition to that, you have issues with Layer 2 coming up, and so any off scheme that would rely on crypto keys for signing would then also have to take a look at the crypto keys of ships owned on Layer 2. And so then you have this issue of, Infura and other parts of the ecosystem don't support that natively, and then you have to implement other APIs to get that to work in a service that watches the Layer 2 and then allows you to find those keys. So there's a lot of complexity there on both sides of the spectrum of just going pure signing with crypto keys, and also the limits people who are using Urbit hosting services to, because they don't own their identities generally. Depending on how it's set up, but most people don't have their crypto keys if they just pay through a hosting service, and so those people will be left out as well. And so neither of these two options really made sense because of a lot of trade-offs. So effectively, I sat down. I also talked with Neil Davis, Lagrif Nakfep, who is also an advisor for DC Spark for Urbit-related matters. And so we kind of brainstormed a bit. Then I spent some more time on my end just specking out what is the simplest possible protocol that we can create in order to authenticate someone using their Urbit ID. And so that's effectively how we came to building Authenticate with Urbit ID as a Gull agent. And I'll want to effectively go in this video into how the protocol works so that if you're curious about this, you can kind of have an innate understanding so that if you have a website and you want to integrate Authenticate with Urbit ID, you'll understand what the workflow is, and then what from your perspective as a developer, as an implementer into existing Web 2 websites or Web 2 services who want to authenticate Urbit IDs, what's the actual protocol effectively, so you know what the heck you do. So, in short, Urbit has by default peer-to-peer messaging that is inherently tied to identities. And so what's nice about that is with other identity schemes, you don't have the peer-to-peer messaging tied to the identity, but we have that as a primitive. So the simplest possible way to authenticate someone is to, out of band, provide them with a message. So that means, for example, for your web server or website, when a person tries to log in with their Urbit ID, they tell you their PAT-P, their ID, then you register their Urbit ID inside of the Gall agent. This happens automatically. A random auth code is generated, and inside the Gall agent, it's tied to that PAT-P. Then that auth code is sent out of band to the user who is requesting to be authenticated, to be logged in. And then this user takes the auth code and via Urbit sends the auth code via a direct message to the ship that is running the Authenticate with Urbit ID Gall agent. And so effectively, we create this loop where the user talks to the web server has a ship that it trusts, either its own ship or a third-party service running the ship for them. This ship that's running the service has the Authenticate with Urbit ID Gall agent installed. It generates the auth code, and then that auth code gets passed to the user sends it via DM, and then the Gall agent sees that the DM was sent, reads the auth code, and then it effectively triggers inside of its internal state that user is authenticated. Then the web server can effectively ping an endpoint on the Gall agent that says, hey, is the user who requested the auth code to be generated, is that user authenticated? And so effectively the web server can ping that endpoint it can poll it every 5-10 seconds or every second even. And effectively, once the user authenticates themselves, then that endpoint will return true. And so when the web server sees that endpoint returns true, then the user has been authenticated, because direct messages rely on the user actually owning that identity, having the ship running, and having the two ships, the ship running the Authenticate with Urbit ID Gall agent and the user running their ship with their ID, they have to communicate, meaning they have to exchange keys to do a Diffie-Hellman key exchange so that they can have a symmetric key so that then they can message each other with end-to-end encryption. And so effectively, because all of that is baked in, we don't have to actually do the authentication ourselves, because the very fact that the user sends a DM means they are who they say they are. So we're using the primitives of the Urbit network itself to do the authentication, and we're simply creating a loop, so to speak, that allows the user to claim I am X PAT-P, and then gets an auth code and sends it to the Authenticate with the ship running the Authenticate with Urbit ID Gall agent, and as such, creating that loop, proving they are who they say they are. One finer detail there is that when a user authenticates themselves, they authenticate themselves for one single time. And so what this means is that when the web server or the website, when they poll the Gall agent, so this is all exposed via an HTTP interface, and so luckily you don't have to manually go through an airlock and through all those problems, but you can just, you don't have to authenticate yourself from the web server perspective effectively. And so there's just HTTP endpoints available that you can hit and easily integrate into your website or web server. And so it's pretty trivial in terms of implementation, from an implementation perspective. And so effectively what this allows us to do is have the user authenticate themselves. When the service checks that the user is authenticated and it returns true, then that internal state for the user inside the Authenticate with Urbit ID Gall agent goes from true to false. So, the user did authenticate themselves, but that authentication, when read, it's consumed effectively. So every authentication happens one time. And then the web service has a proof that the user is who they say they are. And so then they can go through their login process or authentication process, depending if it's a website or a web server for like an API. And then the user moves forward in the login flow. And so then the website just continues their standard Web 2 login procedure. And potentially, if this is the first time the user logs in, it might create an account which has that user's PAT-P, and the only login method available for that user is to re-authenticate themselves every time through this method. So that's effectively, in a nutshell, how this works. And what's really cool is that, as I mentioned, this is done via DMs. And so you could say, oh, that's kind of a crappy interface. It's very manual, right? The user has to go and copy the ship running authenticate with Urbit ID PAT-P. Then they have to copy the auth code and submit it and do a DM manually. However, one of the great things that we have available to us is UrbitVisor. And so what this means is that when the web server or website wants the user to actually DM the auth code, rather than manually showing them the PAT-P and the auth code, which maybe in some circumstances is sufficient or useful, maybe for services that aren't in the web browser. However, we can actually take advantage of UrbitVisor, and so if the website integrates with UrbitVisor, the user only has to click, send auth code. Some perms will come up, a pop-up will come up asking the user to accept permissions to send a DM, so issue a poke. And then from there, the user literally just clicks a button, accepts permissions, and automatically that auth code will be sent via DM to the ship that's running the Gall agent, and the user is authenticated. So from the user perspective, all they do is go on the website, click login with UrbitVisor. The user accepts the permissions for the website, types in their master password, okay, and then from there, automatically the website itself will take the auth code, which is pulled from the back end of the website, which is talking to the ship with the Gall agent. That gets pushed to the front end of the website. The front end then calls UrbitVisor, and UrbitVisor sends it to the Urbit ship, which then DMs it back to the ship running the Gall agent. And so we have that entire loop, but from the user perspective, all they do is click one button and accept permissions. Once they've accepted permissions, next time, literally all they have to do is click login with Urbit, and then just nothing else, and maybe wait a second while that whole loop automatically happens behind the scenes for them. And so rather than dealing with like OAuth and having all the complexity with like copy pasting those codes, rather than dealing with signing crypto keys, which would require a full-fledged wallet, this is the middle ground that enables a seamless user experience when integrated with UrbitVisor. And this is specifically the reason why we went with this route. It enables anyone from Moons, Comets, people on Urbit hosting services, people on Layer 2 to have support and to take advantage of Authenticate with Urbit ID, while it also simplifies the entire process. So that was kind of an overview of the entire protocol. And so we are today officially releasing the Authenticate with Urbit ID Gall app in this repo. And in addition to that, we will also be releasing a Medium post by Neil Davis, who wrote the Gall agent. So I primarily designed the protocol. Neil primarily implemented it as a Gall agent. And then Neil, because he's a great professor who's really good at writing educational material, he's also has also written an entire Medium post, which you can find online at the DC Spark Medium, and it'll be linked below in the description. And this goes through the entire protocol and how it works, what the endpoints are, and then how you as a developer or implementer can integrate this into your stack by understanding the implementation itself. I explained the protocol at a high level, and then this goes in deeper how it actually works. In the GitHub repo itself, you can find installation instructions, in addition to API examples and example workflows. Then in the Medium post, you can have deeper explanation, kind of going on the higher level of what I mentioned in this video, plus on the lower level of the actual implementation and how you can go about testing this on your own, with your own ships. And then with these two parts, any implementer effectively has everything they need to start adding this to their websites. To be clear, we only implemented the Gull agent, and so the integration into all the various web services and web backends, we can't practically support literally every backend for the web that there is. First of all, it's a lot of work, and second of all, probably not that high value right now. And the other point that I also didn't want to mention is that for the integration of UrbAdvisor, that is not integrated as a component you can just plug and play. Also because that depends highly on integrating with the web backend that the developer is using. And so while UrbAdvisor has all the endpoints available to easily send a DM and issue the pokes to do that, there isn't a one-click solution that people can start using today. But this is effectively all the core primitives and explanations of how to use the Gull agent to then incorporate into websites and web services, so that any decent web developer can take all this information, install the Gull agent on their ship, set up the whole backend to integrate with this, and then have it integrate with UrbAdvisor seamlessly as well. We're more than happy to answer any questions, to help people out. But effectively, this is the Gull agent itself released with all the instructions you need to get up started running today. Currently, especially because of the recent updates with Kelvin versions and so forth, with this release, we're only releasing the repo. And so you'll have to install the Gull agent yourself via the instructions here. However, in the following week, we will be deploying a moon from our DC Spark Star, Havbex, and we will have a moon that will have the Authenticate with Urbit ID Gull agent in a desk that you can install from Urbit via software distribution. And so it'll be as simple as copy and pasting a single line into your Urbit Dojo or terminal, and then from there you'll have Authenticate with Urbit ID installed nearly instantly on your ship. So with all that said and done, we're really excited to release this, have the next step of the process for bridging the old web with Urbit, and having something that has really strong potential to integrate with UrbAdvisor to provide a next generation UX for having your Urbit ID be a first class primitive even for the old web. And so we're really excited about this, and this is effectively the very first step. And most likely, besides the Medium post, which Neil wrote himself, next week, as I mentioned, we'll be deploying the Gull agent for everyone to install publicly. And Neil will also be releasing a short video on the DC Spark YouTube channel going into the implementation and a bit more about specifics, not on the high level like I did in this video, but how the implementation and the Gull agent itself works, how you can get it set up, and so forth. So, stay tuned, test out this Gull agent yourself if you're really excited, and if you have, your own website, web service that you want to integrate, logging into your service, that's a, classic Web 2 service that you want your users to have the ability to use their Urbit IDs for. And, please give us feedback, file issues, maybe make a PR if you want to make some changes that you think could improve the Gull agent. And feel free to take a look. Everything's open source and everything's available for you to explore at your own leisure. So I'm really excited just to share this with you. Neil did a great job with this, and overall I think it's really exciting to see We have UrbAdvisor, now we have this Authenticator for Urbit ID Goal agent. We're working on all of the infrastructure for enabling UV extensions, so web extensions that are powered by UrbAdvisor to interact directly with Urbit Ship. And then we're working on the Twitter UV extension, which will enable Twitter to be slowly consumed via Urbit by people sharing threads and individual tweets easily back onto Urbit at the click of a button. And so we're starting to build all this really exciting infrastructure for taking the old web and bridging it into Urbit and taking all the benefits of Urbit and empowering the current web with those.